Luke chapter 9, verses 37 through 50. This takes place right after the Transfiguration. So this is what takes place as the disciples and Jesus are coming down the mountain. The next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him, right? And that makes it really obvious why Jesus has to go pray, because as soon as he gets back to society, there's people waiting for him. So we'll go to our plot line and we'll look at verse 37, and the people are waiting for Jesus. And they have gathered because there's quite a spectacle here. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." So we'll just break that down. A man in the crowd calls out, so there's somebody here who wants Jesus' help. "I beg you to look at my son." He doesn't say exactly what's wrong at first, just look at him. The first thing he wants to say is this: "For he is my only child." He is my only son. That seems to be one of those elements of the story Luke really wants to draw our attention to, right? We can sympathize with how precious the only child is, which makes us just look up to God and say, "Thank you for giving us your only son." So the man's only son has a problem. A spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. The first thing we see, a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him, and is destroying him. Wow, what a terrible situation to be in for this man. The demon is destroying his son. This is an important word for us to consider, because this destruction of the boy is not unlike, remember Legion, who that legion of demons was cast into those pigs, and they immediately ran off a cliff and died. Other gospels, Mark would tell us that every time this boy every time that this demon takes control of this boy, it tries to not just give him a seizure, but throw him into fire. It is trying to kill him. So let's go back to our plot arc. Verses 38 through 39. The boy is tormented by a demon, literally trying to kill him. And the father, right, has brought him to the disciples for healing. "I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." So we'll go back to our plot arc real quick. Verse 40. The disciples could not drive him out. I'll say it out. Okay? And as we think about that, we can sympathize with the disciples, right? They've been given this authority, which so far had never failed. And then Jesus goes on up a mountain, but only with the three, not with the rest of them. And while Jesus is gone, that's when the problems come. That's when the demon they can't drive out shows up. And you can understand just how difficult this moment is for the disciples, how challenging it would be. We've all been at those points in life where we think we're doing what's right, and it just does not seem to be working out. Jesus speaks up. He says, "You unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." And you should be thinking right away, you unbelieving and perverse generation. You should be asking yourself, who is the you? Who is the you, right? And we have three options. We have number one, the crowds. We have number two, the dad. And then we have number three, the disciples, right? And if it's the disciples, then Jesus is saying, Oh, you faithless, unbelieving, perverse disciples, how could you not drive this demon out? So that's one option. Or it's the dad. Oh, you perverse, unbelieving dad, you couldn't drive this demon out. Or you don't believe enough. That's the problem, right? Well, what's really cool about this is that we have Mark's gospel. And just real quick, Mark's gospel, the disciples come up afterwards and they ask Jesus, why couldn't we drive it out? And he doesn't say it's because you didn't believe, and he doesn't say it's because you're perverse. He says because this kind can only be driven out by prayer and fasting. Which reminds us that, not always will a demon leave instantly. Sometimes we have to pray and fast over time for God to deliver someone from a demon. So it's not the demon. It's not the disciples. I don't think that's who he's talking to. The dad is interesting. He says, if you can heal my son, heal him. And Jesus says, if I can, anything is possible for he who believes. And the dad says, I believe. Help my unbelief. So I don't think it's the dad either, because he believes, right? That's why he's asking for help. Well, that just leaves us with the crowds, this unbelieving and perverse generation. I don't know, but we can imagine a scene where disciple 1 tries to cast the demon out and he fails, and disciple 2 tries to cast the demon out and he fails, and disciple 3 tries to cast the demon out and he fails, and before long a crowd has gathered to watch these disciples fail to drive out this demon. They've finally come up against a foe greater than they can handle. I think that's what's going on. So when Jesus says, you unbelieving and perverse generation, he's talking to these crowds, and he doesn't like how, healing has become some sort of a spectator sport. How long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here. So that's verse 41. Verse 41, Jesus rebukes the crowds who make sport, if you will, make sport of God's power. Be very careful, brothers and sisters, not to fall into that trap. Verse 42, even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him down on the ground in a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the impure spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. So the demon gets one last fit in here, throws him on the ground in a convulsion. Jesus immediately rebukes the impure spirit and heals the boy and gave him back to his father. Now, we can ask ourselves, is the healing of the boy and the rebuking of the spirit the same act or two different acts? If it is two different acts, then not only was the boy possessed by an impure spirit, but he may have also had epilepsy. Like the demon and the epilepsy are both in this boy, both leading to convulsions. And maybe the epilepsy leads to the convulsion, but then the demon is trying to put him in the fire, or some combination of the both. That's just a possibility. I don't know if that's true or not. And gave him back to his father. So verse 42. Verse 42. The boy is healed and given back to his father. That's one of those words that Luke will say repeatedly in the gospel, that Jesus gives this person back to their parents. And what a beautiful picture of what Christ does in our lives, does he not? He does give parents back their children. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. There's the crowds, right? Verse 43. They got what they wanted. They got it was close. In the 12th round, Jesus showed up and won, right? So crowds are amazed. And you're like, well, isn't that the point, the high point of the story, when Jesus heals them? And I don't think it is, because in the middle of this crowd's amazement, I think then we get the true high point of this story. Jesus decides to take that moment while everyone was marveling at Jesus, and that's when he says to his disciples, listen carefully. Listen carefully. Let these words sink in to what I'm about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. He tells them here in this moment of the crowd's praise, that in a little while he's going to be delivered. That means betrayed. He's going to be betrayed into the hands of men, right? Killed. So it's in this moment, it's in this high moment of excitement that Jesus decides to share with them this truth, this shocking, jarring truth that he is going to be killed via betrayal. So that's the high point. Jesus announces he will be killed through betrayal, which is just shocking, right? And we should be thinking, why now? Why, as the crowds are amazed, does Jesus then talk about his betrayal? What does Jesus see while everyone's marveling at all he did? What does Jesus see? That's what we should be asking. What does Jesus see that is so ripe for teaching the disciples this lesson here and now? And we will answer that later. First, let's get 45 up on the plot line. They did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them so that they did not grasp it. And they were afraid to ask him about it. So the disciples, verse 45, the disciples are confused and scared. And then we get verse 46. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Of all times, right after Jesus says, one of y'all is going to betray me, they're arguing, who's the greatest among us? Unbelievable. But that's us, right? That's humanity. Like every time you look at the disciples and you say unbelievable, just look back in the mirror and be like, yep, and that's me. So one question we could ask is, how did this conversation start? And you could imagine some snide comment from Peter, like, oh, I would have been able to cast that demon out. Or the 9 going up to the 3 and being like, hey, what'd you guys go see up on the mountain? And they're like, oh, it was amazing. It was awesome. It was wonderful, but we can't tell you, right? But you can imagine very easily, and especially in this situation where emotions are so raw, that it wouldn't be hard for all of the comparisons to just kind of come out in just the worst ways, where we're arguing about who is the greatest. And that's exactly what happens. Verse 46, they argue about who is the greatest, which shows us what? It shows us that they are not listening to what Jesus is talking about. If you had 2 brain cells, if you were really listening, you would know this is probably not the time to have this argument. And also, they're talking about who's greatest, right? What are they thinking about when greatest? Greatest in God's eyes? No, greatest in man's eyes, right? And so what it shows is what they're passionate about is the crowds, the glory that the crowds give. Oh, maybe that's why Jesus is saying, as the crowds are amazed, it's not all about glory, it's about suffering. This is a path of suffering. This is not a path of glory that we're taking. Eventually it leads to glory, but right now it is suffering. Don't be enamored with the praise of men. And now suddenly that becomes clear. Okay, now we understand why Jesus would use this moment. So what is he going to say in response to this argument about the greatest? Jesus, knowing the thoughts, took a little child with him and had him stand beside him. So we'll just go there to the plot arc, verse 47. Jesus brings in a child as an object lesson. By the way, in Mark's gospel, he tells us that the argument happened on the way to Capernaum, and then once in Capernaum, Jesus confronts these guys, just for a little bit of timeline. Then he said to them, whoever welcomes this child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me, for it is the one who is least among you who is the greatest. 3 parts to this. Number 1, whoever welcomes the child in my name welcomes me. We'll go red. Number 2, whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And then we'll go number 3. For it is the one who is least among you who is greatest. And we'll go green here. Okay. 48, A, B, and C. All right, that's what we'll go. 48, A, B, and C. 48, A. To welcome a child in Jesus' name is to welcome Jesus. It's the first thing that we can kind of observe in this 48b. To welcome Jesus is to welcome God, the Father. And 48c, and I should have spaced that differently. 48c, I think, is the top of it. 48c, and there it's the least is the greatest. Okay. How does that become true? The least is the greatest, because Jesus, who takes this path of suffering, who serves everybody, who becomes the least in order to serve, he is the greatest. He is the greatest. So Jesus is this. Because it's true of Christ, it becomes true of everything, right? God is laying down the law for us here. Okay, but now he's talking about in 48a and b, what does this look like? It looks like it starts with welcoming a child in Jesus' name. All right, let's go back over here to our text. The question we have to ask is, why is this significant? Right here. We'll get this in yellow. Why is this significant? I mean, welcoming a child in Jesus' name, what's special about that? Well, a little context. Rabbis didn't spend a lot of time teaching kids, often thought they were a bit of a nuisance because under 12, kids did not learn Torah. They did not get trained in that sort of a thing. So the rabbi who was saying, so to the rabbi, it's not a great use of time to spend time with the littles. That is a task that's beneath me, right? And whenever we're getting to arguments about the greatest, that's one of the fallouts of this. It's like all of a sudden someone's too important to take out the trash. Someone's too important to wash the dishes. Someone's too important to do anything or whatever. But suddenly tasks become beneath people. And the further you get along that, not only do tasks become beneath people, but people are not worth my time. You're not worth my time. And so Jesus says, whoever welcomes this little child, the least of these, in my name, that person welcomes me. That person welcomes me. This is someone who has humbled themselves, and they say, no one is above me. No one is too low for me to serve. I will serve. I will welcome. I will bless anyone. And when you welcome a child in Jesus' name, so that comes from your relationship with Christ, from seeing him do this, from being the recipient of his welcoming, from all that, from being transformed by the gospel. When you do that, then you welcome the one who sent me. You welcome God the Father. And then the last one becomes true, right? For it is the one who is least among you all. That's the one who's willing to serve anybody. They're the one who is the greatest. The most servant-hearted is the greatest. Beautiful, beautiful lesson for all of us. And then it closes with 49 through 50. So that's the second lesson. And now 49 through 50 is the falling action. And it's this last story of a man casting out demons, and Jesus teaching if they oh gosh, I don't want to mess it up. Whoever is not against you is for you. Good, got it. If they are not against us, they are for us. Okay. Whoever is not against you is for you. Let's talk about context, because actually in chapter 11, Jesus says the opposite. Whoever is not for you is against you. But context here tells us that what we have is some other person out there who's not one of the 12, not one of those disciples of Jesus. Someone out there is casting out demons in your name. right? And that's a tough one because they were failing to cast out a demon just a little bit ago. We tried to stop him because he's not one of us, right? And this is where, again, if you're like looking for the world's glory, him not being one of us is like, hey, well, I don't know if that's right. I think we're the ones who have the authority. We're the ones with the power. What is he doing out there? And Jesus is trying to make a point, guys. This is not a race for glory. This is not to puff up or to be the cool ones or anything like that. Don't stop him. Jesus said he's doing kingdom work, right? For whoever is not against you is for you. Whoever's not against you is for you, right? When we see other churches, when you see other Christians doing well, when you see fruit, when you see the Lord working, we should rejoice, right? This isn't a competition. We're not competing with other churches. We're not competing with other Christians. We're all working for the Lord. And so when it comes to true believers, if they're not against us, then they're for us. In 11, by the way, the context would be the opposite. He'll be talking about the enemy. And so it's actually the same principle in chapter 9 and in chapter 11, but just with the reversed context. And so the words get reversed as well. But it's just a nice little, 49 through 50 is a nice kind of a closing lesson on everything else in this text that just gives one more application of this principle that whoever is least among you is the greatest. And so that is how this whole thing works out. Jesus is living it. He is the example. He's teaching the example to his disciples. They're not getting it, but one day they will. And by God's grace, this lesson be applied to our lives. It's another one that we're going to learn over and over again in our own lives. And praise the Lord that he is patient because don't we need it? All right. Have a good one, guys.